OSU Potawatomi County Horticulture Program. And so we appreciate you coming today. The tribe has another activity today, so our attendance is way down from some of the ones that we've done. But we appreciate you coming today and hope that we can be kind of informal and really, answer questions. I have 3 flyers that I'm going to share with you. There are some upcoming field days. So one of these is a spring turf and landscape field day, May 17th. We have a greenhouse field day on June the 8th. This one is in Duncan. And then there is also a turf field day at the Oklahoma City Dodgers Stadium in Bricktown. And so all of these events are free. They are things that you can go and do. Some of them provide a lunch, but you do need to register for the one in Stillwater. So some of them have registration and some do not. I will put these flyers over on the side table, and then if you can take a picture of it, I didn't make copies today, but, or you can email me and I will send it to you directly. So today for our program, we have Becky Carroll, and she is one of our state specialists for fruit production. And so we have known each other a really long time, and I appreciate her coming to present the fruit information to you today. Her experience is way beyond mine, but it's fun to learn from each other. So I think I shared with you last time, our Master Gardeners do have a plant sale tomorrow. So while I have your captive attention, I have some little cards on that over here also, and you are welcome to come by and maybe find some fruit or vegetables that you can grow that goes with our theme here. So anyway, thank you for coming, and I'll let you take over. You can use the mic if you like. Do you need the mic for recording? Does it matter?
Oh, no, it's good.
Okay.
All right, well, I will try to get by without it because I'm talking my hands a lot anyway. So my name is Becky Carroll, and I'm the state specialist for fruits and pecans. So I'm fruity and nutty, and so that's, I'm just a little different, I guess. But I've been at OSU for 35 years and have been growing fruits since forever, pretty much. And my parents bought my great-grandfather's house when I was just little, and he had an orchard with apples and peaches and things too. So I've been around fruit trees my whole life, and I don't think there's anything much better than a tree-ripened peach. It's just the best, right? And so we're going to be talking about some fruits, tree fruits and small fruits. And I've got some things we can do a show and tell in a little bit. And if you have questions as we're going along, you're welcome to holler, and we'll stop and take care of any questions as we go. But we'll get started, and just want to make sure that you realize that you want to select fruits that are going to be adapted to our climate and Oklahoma's weather conditions. And so we want to look for things that have good winter hardiness, things that are able to, withstand our cold conditions. But also we want to look at things that can handle a spring frost, because we often get those early or late spring frost, even into late April sometimes. But in this past year and several other years, we've gotten an early fall freeze. Last year we had October 19th, we had a freeze, and that froze a lot of the pecans in the shucks, so that was really detrimental. But it also, I think, has caused a lot of wood damage to a lot of our trees that were not senescing or getting ready for the winter. And so those fall freezes can cause problems as well. We also need to make sure that we are planting things that are adapted to our chilling hour requirements. And Oklahoma ranges between 800 and about 1,200 chilling hours. And chilling hours are temperatures between 34 and 45 degrees after dormancy. And so each hour in those temperatures, then that counts as a chilling hour. So they need to have enough chilling to be able to flower and fruit and come out properly in the spring. So if they don't have enough chilling, it throws them into kind of a, upsets how they flower, they may not fruit properly, and it does a lot of strange things. But we also need to make sure we have enough growing degree days. So I had someone call from western Oklahoma, way out west and kind of northwest, and they said, I haven't seen anybody growing apricots in this area, so I would like to plant 5 acres of apricots. And I was like, ooh, okay. Well, let's think about this. Why do you think you haven't seen anyone growing apricots in your area? And so we talked through it, and by the end of it, she understood why she might start with a few trees instead of 5 acres. But they just bloom so very, very early that they're really not acclimated to especially a commercial venture. Maybe a few trees in your backyard, it's less risk, but a big commercial planting, it's just not viable, especially in northwestern Oklahoma. So this was October 2020 at the research station. We had about 1 inch of ice. Our trees were green and fully leafed out, and we had that ice storm come through and everything just was laying down on the ground almost. Our pecan trees took it very hard because they had a big pecan crop as well. So we lost maybe 50 to 75% of the canopy on our pecan trees. But these small apple trees that were in the demonstration block, after that ice melted, they just kind of popped right back up because they were pretty bendable. They weren't they're young, so they hadn't got a lot of structure to them. So we also want to look for the best site for your plantings. And it doesn't mean in a big pasture area, but it's also important just in your backyard. There are sites that might be better for specific trees. But cold air is like water. It flows downhill, settles on the bottom. And so in that low area, like on that picture, that's what we call a frost pocket. So if we plant our fruit trees that are early blooming down in those low frost pocket areas, then there's less chance that we're going to get good production. We want to plant them up on top of the hill if everything is okay on soils and everything. But that way that cold air settles away from them and they have a better chance to withstand those spring freezes. So on the other side, it shows a frost pocket up on the side of the hill. And that's because the cold air, the drainage is impeded by maybe an overgrown fence row, a building or hedge or something where that cold air can't move on down away from that area. And so sometimes it just means opening up a little area in a hedge or something where the cold air can flow on down. But if we can have just a slight slope, and even just maybe a foot or two makes a huge difference over an area. So frost protection is especially important for things like peaches and nectarines and apricots, those things that bloom very early, and cherries. We also want to make sure that we have enough space available for our trees. If we have a limited planting area, if we plant a big standard apple tree, that could be 30 foot wide by maybe 30 feet tall. They can be very, very huge. And on apples, we need to have 2 trees for good pollination. So if you have limited space, you want to look at things that maybe have a dwarfing rootstock or have a different growth habit, maybe smaller. And then for soils, I live in Lincoln County, just up the highway on 177, and my soil is red clay. It is the kind that you could probably make nice bricks out of. It's just really, really not the greatest for growing much of anything other than Bermuda and cattle. But if you have heavy, poorly drained soils, you probably want to stay away from things like cherries and peaches and nectarines. They can't tolerate having wet roots, and those clay soils hold a lot of water. So they need to have very well-drained soil. And we'll talk a bit about how you might be able to get around some of that. So even just an area in your yard may make a big difference between So the year before you plant, and this is for a large planting or even for your home garden, you want to do a soil test the year before you plant, okay? Make sure that you know the nutrient level, the pH levels in that soil. So do that soil test, correct your pH and your phosphorus and potassium levels before you plant if possible. And so that way, we know that pH is extremely important for specific plants, but it also affects how they take up nutrients from the soil. And phosphorus and potassium are very slow moving when they're applied to the soil surface. So if you can incorporate it into the soil before planting, it might have a better chance to get where it needs to be, where those roots are. Now on your soil test, they'll give you a nitrogen number, but we don't pay any attention to that number on fruit trees or pecan trees on pre-planting. We're going to add our nitrogen after those trees begin to grow. And so we'll just add that later. So another thing you want to do is control your perennial weeds. What's a perennial weed? Can you name one? What's a perennial weed that you might see in your lawn or what?
Dandelions.
Dandelions?
Johnson grass.
Johnson grass is a big one. Johnson grass or Bermuda grass. Bermuda grass can be another one. But it could also be something like maybe if you're trying to plant an area that's a little overgrown, you might have some wild blackberries or something. So you want to control those things, like the grasses especially, like Bermuda and Johnson grass, before you plant. Because it's much easier to get rid of those before you have your tree or whatever you're planting in place. And also, we encourage planting a cover crop. If you clean all the weeds out, then plant something, a cover crop in that area. It may be supplying some nitrogen, or it may be just there to be a source of organic matter. You won't harvest that, but you can till it in before you plant, and it will just add organic matter to the soil. Oklahoma doesn't have a lot of organic matter, and so anything we can do to add some is going to be beneficial. So another thing to think about the year before planting, and this is hard. Most people, they just get a fancy and they're like, I'm going to plant some fruit trees, and it's already April. And so you want to think about it before that time frame, even in the fall. Place your tree order early. And for fruit trees, I recommend using a nursery that specializes in growing fruit trees. We're going to get the best quality, the most variety selection if we go to one of those nurseries that specializes in growing fruit trees. They're going to be more chance of being accurate varieties grafted onto those trees as well. So I like to order from nurseries, and I have a list if anyone's interested in looking at a nursery list. But I like to order them early and have them shipped to me in mid-February to early March. And I buy bare root fruit trees, and so they're usually less expensive and they're easier to plant and do really well during that spring time frame. We recommend using appropriate rootstocks. So buy something that's going to be adapted to our soils and our climate. And also, if you can find smaller trees, that's going to be helpful as well. A lot of fruit trees have a specific structure that we want to set as they're growing. So we train them in a specific shape. If you have a large tree, it's difficult to get that ideal structure set if it's already really big. And also, smaller trees are less expensive. They transplant easier without, they have less transplanting shock. And so the tree on the right, or on the left over here, my husband is 6'4". And that was a peach tree at a local greenhouse selling fruit trees. And it is probably close to 9 foot tall. But a peach tree, when we plant them, we cut them off at knee high, okay? So you're buying a tree that's 9 foot tall and you're cutting it off at about 18 inches or so. So you're spending a lot of money on something that you don't need. So start with a smaller tree, and you have less stress on you cutting it back to knee high, but you can also save money and be able to set that structure easier. Schedule your shipment when it's easy for you. I like that mid-February to early March time frame. And then, we'll talk about training in just a minute, but on peaches, if you think about a peach tree, does the trunk grow any fruit? No, it's just there as the stability, right? It's there to have other scaffold branches on. So if our trunk is this high, where is our fruiting wood? It's going to be way up here, right? So if our trunk, it ends at knee high, we start our scaffold branches, or the fruiting wood, much lower. So we can keep our fruiting wood much lower to the ground. It's easier for us to harvest and thin that fruit and spray it and take care of it. And so a shorter trunk allows us to have that open structure that we want, and we'll talk about it in a minute, but it also keeps our fruiting wood closer to us. If we have a big tall tree, much harder to manage. Okay? All right, so we'll talk about the soils, and like I said, my soil is that brick making kind of clay, and so that's not ideal for most fruit trees. Most fruit trees want a well-drained, loamy soil. For most fruit trees, the pH is between 6 and 6.5 or 7. That's going to be okay for most fruit trees. And also for most of our small fruits, except for blueberry. Blueberries need a pH of 4.5 to 5.5, very acidic soil. And I'm not sure what it ranges in up here. What higher than that?
It varies a lot.
Okay, so that's why we do our soil testing, if you have a lot of variability. But in areas where you don't have that very acidic soil, I recommend planting blueberries in containers. And we'll talk about that in just a little bit as well. Like in my site, blueberries wouldn't do well because of the heavy soil, the inability to drain well. So I'm growing blueberries in smart pots at my house. And we want a minimum of about 3 foot of good soil for our roots to grow in and take up nutrients and water. And if we have something impeding that soil level, maybe a rock layer or hard pan or even a high water table, and we only have maybe a foot of good soil before something's impeding that drainage, our tree is going to grow down to that rock layer or the water table, and it's going to stop. The roots won't go on through it. And so we end up with just a very shallow root system, and that tree doesn't have as much soil to take up nutrients and water. So it's going to be more stressed in times of drought and it won't take up enough nutrients at times. So deeper soil is better. And like I said, cherries, nectarines, peaches, they don't tolerate standing in water. Having wet feet is what we call it. They don't like to have their tennis shoes wet. They don't like that. So if we have, these 2 peach trees are in my backyard. They were anyway. One of them's not there anymore. But this was in 2018, and that spring we had rains just about every week. And so they both had a crop set on them that spring, and then the rains started. And you can tell on the left tree, it started losing some of those leaves. They started yellowing on the interior, and that's what this tree started out like as well. So they yellowed, they started dropping some of those interior leaves, but this tree went ahead, the fruit shriveled up and they dropped off, and it was just bare. There was nothing there. This tree ended up just losing those interior leaves, but it ripened the fruit and it did okay through that year. The only difference was about from here to yourself right here, not that many feet in between the trees, But this one is on a terrace. The one on the left side is on a terrace, a little bit of an area that's raised above the soil surface. And so it has a little bit more soil drainage. This one was in a flat area, and so it didn't have that extra soil drainage. It just couldn't handle having that much moisture on the roots. So it ended up dying that year. In one season, that tree died, okay? That tree is still producing. I have peaches on it this year, so I'm excited. So you can tell, just even in your backyard, there's a big difference on where you plant those trees. All right, so one thing I wanted to touch on was in Oklahoma, you know, we have some crazy weather sometimes. We just never know what it's going to be like. And so we have a big risk for frost damage, especially in those spring months. So this year, a lot of our fruit trees were blooming the first part of March. They were really early. And normally a peach tree, they're going to be blooming the middle of March. That's when most all peaches bloom, is the middle of March. But it was blooming a couple of weeks early this year. So if we have temperatures below 27 or 28 degrees, and we have flowers out there, we're going to see some damage. It depends on the stage of flowering, how much damage will occur and what temperature we drop down to. I thought we had lost all of our fruits that were blooming at the research station, but some were far enough behind in development. They didn't all bloom at the same time. Some were a little bit tighter. And so those were saved when we got really cold in late April. And when the freeze happened this year, it's been so many. But whenever we got cold, those fruit buds were not damaged because they weren't out as far. So this bud would have much better chance to survive a cold spell than this flower. So it all depends on the stage and the temperature that we get to. Apricots and almonds are usually the first to bloom, and so we don't often see fruit crops on those trees. I've had some at the station for several years since 2018, and I haven't had any fruit. They have bloomed, but they get frozen back. So I haven't had a crop on apricots or almonds. I usually tell people in the southern part of the state, maybe a crop every 5 to 7 years. Maybe central and southern part of the state, every 5 to 7 years you might get apricots. If you have a microclimate, a little protected area in your backyard that stays a little warmer, then you might have a better chance to have apricots or almonds. Peaches, like I said, they all bloom about mid-March most years, and then apples and pears usually bloom a little bit later. So it's kind of dependent on the winter and our weather conditions, if we're cool or warm, how they're going to advance. I don't think there's anything prettier than fruit trees blooming. They're just beautiful. All right, so pollination requirements for most fruit trees. It's very important to know what they need before you start planting, because you may need multiple types of fruit trees to get pollination or fruit production. So for peaches, nectarines, blackberries, and sour cherries, they are self-pollinated. So you can have one peach tree, one sour cherry, one blackberry, and still get production, okay? They only have to have one tree. They pollinate their own flowers. But things like apple, pear, sweet cherries, and blueberries need cross-pollination. And so it's not that you can have 2 Red Delicious apple trees and get fruit. You need to have a Red Delicious and a complementary cultivar that will be flowering at the same time to provide that crossover or that pollen sharing between the 2 trees. So if we don't have 2 apples, if we just have one apple tree, it may flower and have beautiful flowers in the spring, but if we don't have a pollinator, then we may not get any production. And this year, because everything was off their schedule a little bit, My apple trees at home, I have a Fuji and an Enterprise, and they usually pollinate each other very well. They were flowering at different times, and so I have a few peaches, or not peaches, a few apples on my Enterprise, and very few I haven't seen very many apples at all on the Fuji. And it was just blooming at a little bit later time. So it's very important also to see our pollinators, our insects out there during that time that they're flowering, especially for those that are cross-pollinated, to move that pollen from tree to tree. And so I had some people say, I didn't see a lot of bee activity this year. Well, that might have been because if it's cool and wet during pollination time, the bees aren't moving. Just like we don't want to be outside working in the rain or the cool temperatures, the bees don't move. But on one of my plum trees at the research station, it was covered with flies. I was really surprised. But I bet they would be doing some of that pollen movement as well. And some other type of insects also move pollen. And we'll talk about one, particular one in just a bit that is kind of different. But insect pollinated types of trees are apples, pears, cherries, peach. Anything that has a big showy flower is normally going to be insect pollinated. Those that are wind pollinated have a much less showy flower. And I have some great flowers here that we'll look at in a little bit. But that's not anything that looks like it would attract a bee or a butterfly or anything, right? They're looking at those big showy flowers. So you can kind of tell the pollination requirements by looking at the flowers. All right, so ripening season. If we look at, look at peaches, we can choose a peach cultivar that will start ripening the end of May, and we can choose one to ripen every couple of weeks, and even through maybe September. We can have peach production from May to September just by cultivar selection, okay? They ripen at different times, so you can extend that season. Just the same with blackberries. You can choose an early ripening, a mid-ripening, and a late ripening, and have a very extended season of production. Now, some people don't want to do that. I like to have my peaches fruit pretty close, in a close window, maybe July to August. I don't want to be out there taking care of them after August, and I want to have freestone peaches, which ripen at maybe July 4th through the first part of August. So peaches, May to October, apples, July to October, and with apples, the summer type of ripening apples, usually more cooking apples, green, tart cooking apples, where the fall type of apples are usually going to be more of a dessert apple or a keeper where you can keep it in storage. Blackberries, May to July, and grapes anywhere from about mid-July through September. So you can extend the season just by cultivar selection. My grandson looks so little there. So one thing we want to do is keep our trees happy and healthy. And that helps with our fruit production, with the quality of the fruit, with the tree life, and just to get better overall success at growing our fruits. But we want to have proper training and pruning, and that's setting that structure early in the life of that tree. That increases the airflow. More air flowing through those branches or those leaves helps prevent disease pressure. And so if we have a really tight canopy where we can't get air through it, it stays wetter. And so those wet conditions promote disease formation. So we want to have a lot of airflow. We also, with our training and pruning, we can increase the sunlight into those, the canopy of the tree. With more sun, usually means more fruit buds. If those shoots are shaded, they won't initiate fruit buds on that wood. It also helps to ripen our fruit properly. Peaches, they need a lot of sunlight. And if they're shaded, they may not ripen like they should. So we want to have an open canopy where we get lots of airflow and sunlight. And that sunlight also helps dry the foliage as well. We want to keep our trees smaller. We can do that with pruning and training. They're easier to thin the fruit, to spray the fruit, harvest the fruit. Everything we need to do is much easier than trying to get on a ladder and doing something off in the ground, which is just more dangerous as well. We can remove diseased limbs when we see those. Just don't leave them out there. If we see diseased fruit or leaves, remove it so it doesn't spread through the rest of the tree. So that's what we call good sanitation, keeping our area free of diseased wood and keeping it clean, and that will help as well. We also want to have good weed control, and I always preach that weed control is more important than nutrients and water. If you're putting out lots of water and fertilizer, but you have lots of weeds, you're just growing more weeds, right? But weeds also reduce the growth of the tree by chemicals that they exude from their root system. So weed controls are really important. We'll talk on that in just a little bit. We want to manage the soil moisture. In my case, where I have clay soil, I can't do a lot to manage it if it's too wet, but I want to keep those trees moist when we have dry conditions. We get lots of cracks in the soil, in that heavy clay soil, and I've been told that it can damage the roots on some of those trees if they're cracking, the soil's cracking and splitting. So manage your soil moisture the best you can. If you notice some of these peaches, like this one out here it's a twin. There's two peaches together. And so that is the lack of soil moisture in the fall when they're initiating those fruit buds. It causes those twins where they're growing together. It doesn't hurt the fruit, it just makes the quality less. You can still eat them. Usually one will go ahead and enlarge and grow fine, and the other one will be small. Looks like maybe a big nose on that peach or something. So we want to monitor the nutrition of our fruit trees, make sure they have enough but not too much fertilizer. And then fruit thinning is very important. And you can see on this little shoot right here of a peach tree, we want to remove most of those peaches. That's really difficult if you don't have peaches every year. But why would we want to remove some of those fruits? Why would that be?
So the nutrients can go to the post and try to.
Okay, so the nutrients, the tree may not be able to produce all of those fruits, that's right. But we also know that if they're over, if we have too many fruits on one tree, they can actually break the limbs. They can put on so much fruit. And last year, when we had a big crop, a lot of people reported to me that they had lost their tree just due to limb breakage. But it also, and you can see, this one is kind of an odd year. We had flowering for an extended period, so we had big peaches and we had very small peaches. But it was because of our chilling hours were lacking last year. And so on this little area, in a 4 to 6 inch shoot, we would want to leave one peach, okay? So we want to have at least 4 to 6 inches between each peach. It's hard to do. Most people won't take those peaches off. But if we do thin them, then we get a lot larger fruit. They go ahead, there's less on the tree, more energy goes into those individual peaches. So they get to be larger, juicier, better quality fruit. If we leave them all on there, they can be very small. They won't have very much peach flesh on them. It'll mostly be seed. And so they just don't ripen properly as well.
So fruit sitting next to that one, you take off all those except the big one.
I would leave that big one and take off the rest. Yeah. And when you're fruit thinning, you can also look for peaches that may have insect feeding on them. They would be some of the first to come off as well. All right, so we can also use cultivar selection for disease resistance. So buying cultivars, like for apple, if we buy the right cultivars, we won't have scab or powdery mildew or cedar apple rust, which is a big issue with a lot of apples. And then some have more susceptibility or resistance to fire so just buying the right cultivar can help eliminate some of those disease issues in our yard. So I have, most of mine at my house are cedar apple rust resistant. And so I only have one tree that is susceptible, and it has the rust on the leaves every year. But that is a kind of an odd disease that we have to have a cedar and an apple close together to complete the life cycle of that disease. And so that's what it looks like on the leaves. It causes spotting, but it also can move to the fruit for cedar apple rust. For pears, some are more resistant to fire blight, hawthorn points rust, and Asian pear rust. This is an Asian pear right here, and it is showing symptoms of one of the pear rust diseases. We don't know a lot about susceptibility because the pear rusts are only been around maybe 5 or 6 years, and so we don't know all of that we need to know for vine-resistant varieties. And then peaches and nectarines, bacterial leaf spot. That middle picture, normally bacterial leaf spot shows up on the leaves. When it's very, very severe, it moves to the fruit itself. This is an O. Henry peach. They can grow it in California without any issues. But when we plant it in central Oklahoma, it loses all the leaves and the fruit cracks and oozes. It's just not possible to grow here. So for a lot of our fruit crops, we're going to have to initiate a spray schedule. And so we want to use IPM as much as possible, integrated pest management. So we're monitoring and trapping, looking for different pests. But in some instances, like peaches, we have to have preventative sprays rather than curative or reactive sprays. So we have to spray before we have an issue. So our protection has to be applied very timely. We need to have very good coverage. So if you're out there trying to spray your tree, it's much easier if that's a smaller tree to spray than if it's a great big tree. And then also, you can use organic or conventional pesticides. It's nothing to say that you can't spray all organically, but you may have to spray more frequently, and you may see a little bit more disease incidence or insect problems, but you can still use organic compounds. Another thing are using fruit bags, and we'll show those to you in just a little bit, and that's what is on that picture on the top left. The fruit bags, you put them on after you thin your peaches or your fruits, and then they stay on the fruit all season. And so that keeps spores and insects from being able to affect that fruit. I used these on a few limbs at my house last year, and my peaches that were bagged were so beautiful when it was harvest time. They were even juicier and prettier than the ones that were just sprayed consistently. Do you have a question?
So it's like when you talk about preventive and reactive, like spraying out pecans, for instance, does that play a big role in the production of the pecan trees and stuff for that?
Yes, it can. It depends on what kind of pecans. If you're growing something like a native pecan tree or some that are more resistant to some of the diseases, then it's not as important. But if you're growing one that has disease issues, an improved cultivar that may have more susceptibility, we have to be spraying before we get the disease. And so we have, Mesonet has a pecan scab advisory model. And so you can put in your area and your susceptibility. If you have natives, it's a certain one. If you have different cultivars, it's different susceptibility levels. And if you put any sprays on, you put that date in there and it will tell you when you need to spray based on the weather conditions. So if you need more information on pecans, I'll be happy to visit with you as well. Or you can email me anytime. Okay. But yeah, we need to be treating before the disease is there. And most of the time on diseases, we're preventing, we're putting it on before we have the disease. Insects, we're usually, if we monitor and when we have the insect, we're treating for it at that point. Except for peaches. Peaches just have to be treated every 10 to 14 days through the season because they have so many different pests. So the top picture is, the one on the right that is brown rot in a peach, and that's why we have to apply fungicides all the time. And the picture on the bottom left then is pear rust, and it's showing up on the fruit, but that's the stage where it is releasing the spores to go back and infect the cedar or the juniper. So peaches, they do require a fungicide application starting at bloom, and we want to continue that every 10 to 14 days until harvest. We incorporate an insecticide spray at petal fall because we don't want to be spraying when the insects are out there pollinating. So we spray that fungicide and insecticide every 10 to 14 days until harvest time. Apples and pears may need some treatment, but much less than a peach or a nectarine. Grapes and berries normally have more issues with disease and less with insects, but it depends on the berry itself. But grapes can get about just about every disease that is known to grapes here in Oklahoma. We just have a lot of issues with our weather conditions. And then blackberries, we encourage our growers to spray an insecticide weekly after they begin to change color. And that's kind of disappointing because blackberries could be grown pretty much as a no-spray crop up until about 10 or 12 years ago when we had a new invasive pest introduced. But they lay eggs in the berries and cause larvae in the fruit. They're very small, so you probably don't see them. It's just fruit-flavored protein, right? All right, so the fruit bags, I'll pass a few out. These are from Clemson University, and it's, like I said, I tested them at my house. It's kind of like a waxed paper, but it has this little tab at the top and a little inset right here. And we just attach them around the fruit after we thin. And we want to be careful to put the little fruit stem in here, wrap it around the fruit. We use this little wire to attach it around the shoot, not around your fruit stem, but around the stem above it, because we don't want extra weight on that little fruit. And then this protects it from any kind of fungal spores or insects. So after thinning time, I'm going to go ahead and try to bag my peaches this weekend, and try to get them bagged right now. They're about maybe quarter size on some. I don't have a lot of peaches at my house. We lost a lot to the freeze. But I'm going to protect the ones we have so we don't have to spray for the rest of the season. If you don't spray, every one of these little drippy spots is showing where an insect has punctured and fed on that fruit. Okay? So it allows enough light to penetrate the bag, and they ripen beautifully, but excludes those insects, the disease spores, and I'm hoping that the squirrels and raccoons will not know what's inside the bag. They'll probably figure it out eventually and say, oh, well, how nice of Becky to wrap my peaches for me. But the raccoons and possums and everything, they can take your fruit off in just a few nights. But although these aren't going to be a no-spray peach, because you still have to spray from bloom until you apply the bag at thinning time, they could be considered a low residue or a reduced spray fruit crop. Okay? So if you were thinking about doing farmer's market, it might be a selling point that it is a reduced spray. Not a no spray, but a reduced spray. Any questions on that? It's kind of cool just to try it out anyway. But it did work for me. So for weeds, I really encourage you to eliminate those perennial weeds before you plant. You can use pre-emergence herbicides to prevent weed seeds from germinating. You can use grass-specific herbicides. They don't kill broadleaves, but our trees are broadleaf plants, but they kill grasses, so that can be helpful. If you are using glyphosate or Roundup, you need to be very careful because fruit trees have very thin bark on the trunks and they can absorb that glyphosate. They also, if you get it on green tissue, driftwise or something, they can take that up as well. So you need to be careful. I like to use these grow tubes. It protects my trees from herbicides, but also from rodents and rabbits and other things chewing on the trunks. And then I have a fact sheet that talks about weed control. But you can use, this is a rubber mulch mat. It's not quite big enough. This is a fabric mulch that works really well. The water can grow through it, but weeds can't grow up through it. But you could also use bark mulch, or here's a more of a manicured look in a lawn. But we don't want to plant flowers and other things in here because they're a weed to our tree. Okay, so they can reduce the growth of that. This is my poor pomegranate at the station, and it's grown up with Bermuda grass, terrible. But I sprayed it with that post, which is specific to the grass. All right, apples, we have lots of different types. Two that work really well together and are pretty disease resistant are Enterprise and Gold Rush. But like I said earlier, make sure you get a cooking or a dessert type depending on what you're looking for. And you can have a standard tree, which can be very large, a semi-dwarf, which can be like 10 to 15 feet tall, and a dwarf fruit stock, which can be very, very small. Apples, we want, like I said, we want to have them blooming at the same time. And not all cultivars will pollinate another. There are some that are called triploids. So sometimes you need to have 3 different types of apple trees to get good pollination through all 3 of the types. Their pollen is sterile on those triploids. And then if you don't have room for another apple tree, you could use a crab apple. They can pollinate an apple as well. There are many apple pollination charts that you can look at to help decide which trees are going to work well together. Cherries are kind of finicky. They'll be doing great, and then we have a really hot, dry period, and they may just wilt and die down to the ground. So they're really kind of finicky. Tart cherries are easier to grow than sweet cherries. And like I said, tart cherries are self-fruitful. You only have to have 1 tree. Sweet cherries, you need cross-pollination, except for Stella, which is a sweet cherry that is self-pollinating. And that's what I had at my house. This was a Stella. This is what the blooms look like. They're just beautiful flowers, and I love the fruit on the trees. But with my clay soils, the fruit would split open. It just had too much moisture. And so the trees would just split the fruit open, and then we would have bees and flies and everything else. So I never got to eat my fruit unless I ate a random insect. That was just part of it. And then I went to Alaska a couple of years ago. We had a flash drought in that fall period. When I got home, I was like, oh, that cherry looks wilted. And I was tired. I didn't care. I was like, it's fall. I'm going to go do something else. Well, my cherry tree that wilted, it didn't come back out the next year. And it was like 7 years old. And so that was just one season did it in. Pears, there's many types to choose from: European, Oriental hybrids, and Asian pears. I have some of the European type and Asian. I love Asian pears. They're very, some people don't like pears because of the texture. They have grit cells in the flesh, but the Asian pear don't have those grit cells, and they're also called apple pears. They're really crunchy and sweet and juicy, like sugary sweet. They have thicker skin a lot of times when you want to peel them, but there's a lot. This is a dripping honey that I'm growing at my house, and they are beautiful fruit. If I can get them harvested before the raccoons, they'll strip my tree and just cannot. Or else it's my brother who lives next door. I don't know. So don't tell him I said that, right? No. So peaches and nectarines, there's, like I said, Lots to choose from, and they can ripen from May all the way through October. But remember, you're spraying them weekly, 10 to 14 days until harvest. I think the middle of August is the latest I would want to have a peach, just because I get tired of spraying, or my husband sprays. But we only have to have one peach tree or one nectarine. They are self-fruitful, but there's a lot of different cultivars to choose from. Why are peaches so difficult to grow? Well, they are an early blooming crop. They bloom very early in the season, so we get a lot of late freezes and we lose the crops. So there's a lot of risk involved. Our fluctuating winter temperatures can cause issues. They are very disease susceptible and insect susceptible. There's not a period during the summertime that insects aren't trying to feed on those fruits. Wildlife love peaches just like we do, and so they'll harvest them a couple of days before you think they're ready to harvest. So it's just kind of aggravating. And you have a high water requirement. You think about those peaches, it's mostly water, and so you have to have enough water to make those fruits high quality. There's an investment in trees and equipment, and they're very labor intensive. Pruning and thinning and everything and spraying takes a lot of time.
Okay.
All right, so figs are something I've been playing with over the last few years. I brought a little fig tree today. This is a Celeste fig. I grew it from a cutting. Took the cutting last year and propagated it. But figs they grow fairly well here in the state, but we get really too cold to keep them as a tree. They're going to be more of a bush. And so this is a list of just a few of the cultivars. I have a lot of different ones. I'm kind of becoming a fig hoarder, have to have one of each kind. And so they do need full sun. You only have to have one fig to produce fruits. And they have very few pests or diseases. They can get hair rust a little bit, but I haven't seen it very frequently. And grasshoppers were really bad last year, and they stripped a few of my leaves. But other than that, deer don't really mess with them. And in a little bit, you can smell that they have a fragrance. So I don't know, and they kind of have fuzzy leaves, so that may be off-putting to the deer. Excuse me, they're grown as a shrub, but you can see on that picture on the left, the little fig that's forming is right there at the shoot of the new growth. So we'll start to see little figs put on this new growth right next to a leaf, so those nodes. And so you can see as they develop, they usually ripen from the bottom up. They might die to the ground every year, but I get new growth about this tall on most of my figs. And so they'll ripen from the bottom up. And when they're green, they're erect and upright. And when they start to be ready to harvest, then they start to droop down. And that signals it's time to harvest. When you cut them open, you think that it looks like seeds. People think they have seeds in them, but they're actually inverted flowers in stem tissue. So it's not even a pollinated flower. The flower parts are inside stem tissue. And so when you cut them open, you can eat the entire thing, the skin and all, but they kind of taste like a floral peach. They kind of have a little bit of that peachy flavor. Some of them may be a little more earthy flavored, but like other fruits, they all taste a little bit different just based on the cultivar. But I am enjoying growing figs, and they're pretty easy to grow. Carly, do we need to take a break or anything, or we just keep going?
It looked like.
You guys want to take a little break, or you want to keep going? It doesn't matter to me. What do you say? Okay, we'll just keep going. We'll just go. All right, so if you plant this little fig in the ground, it's going to grow a lot more new wood, and that's where your fruit production will be. Then this winter, you want to mulch them really heavily too. They like mulch. And then this winter, this will die back to the ground. And then next spring, after it starts to really warm up, it will be later than you would think. You're like, oh, my fig's dead. But no, it will start pushing from the ground. And so you'll get new shoots. So where you have 2 shoots on this one, next year you will have maybe 4 to 5, maybe 6 shoots come up from the roots. They'll die back down to the ground the next year, and then you'll have about double what you had that last year. So it keeps getting bigger. So you want to keep it, you can prune it back to keep it in the space that you want it, or you can let it spread and keep getting bigger. But you can try protecting them with maybe wrapping something around them, filling them with mulch. I've done that before, but they didn't produce as well for me after overwintering that way. They do better when they die to the ground, because everything is 1-year-old wood, so it's fruiting all on that wood. This wood right here is not going to fruit next year because it is older wood.
Do you cut them back to the ground?
After when they've died to the ground, I'll cut them back to the ground. All right, pawpaw is another fruit that people, it's kind of an in fruit right now. People are interested in growing, and it is important to a lot of the tribal communities. I know the Muskogee College they got a grant to do some pawpaw work, but it is native to areas in Oklahoma. But you think of pawpaws as being Indiana, Arkansas, Missouri, Kentucky, that kind of areas where they're found a lot, and even into Kansas as well. It bears the largest native edible fruit. Okay, so it's a big fruit, maybe a pound or 2 per fruit. And so, has anybody eaten a pawpaw? Anybody had one? I haven't either, and I have them. I'm growing them at my house and at the research station. I don't even know if I like them, but they need shade during establishment. So the first 3 years, they need to be shaded, because in nature, when they're found in the wild, they're an understory plant, but they fruit best when they're in full sun. So they ripen in September or October, and they don't have a very long post-harvest life. So once they're ripe, you have to do something with them. Wildlife do harvest them often, but whenever you eat one of these pawpaws, you cut them in half, and you scoop out the flesh on the inside. You don't eat the peel or the skin. They have fairly large seeds inside, and I've been told they taste like a cross between a banana and a mango. I've never tried them, but it's custard-like texture, so it has a very soft texture. So I'm hoping I can taste one this year. I don't know if I will or not, but it's kind of interesting. They do better, or they do need cross-pollination, so a couple of different kinds. In the wild, they grow by root suckers, so they spread, kind of like sand plums or something. They can be a thicket, and so that can be an issue in some areas. The pollination, you can see the flowers at the top picture on the right. They look like little bells, but when you lift them up, it exposes the inside. You can see the flower. The thing about pawpaws is they are not pollinated by bees and butterflies and things, but actually flies and beetles, specifically carrion beetles, pollinate them. So if carrion beetles pollinate them, what do you think the flowers might smell like? Not very good, right? So if they're, and some of the die-hard people that are pawpaw fanatics, they'll throw a dead animal out in their pawpaw area to attract those flies and beetles so they can pollinate their flowers. I'm not going to resort to that, I don't think, but anyway, that's kind of an interesting pollination fact about pawpaws. They are deer-proof. They don't have a lot of pests. I've been looking for more sustainable, easier to grow types of fruits, more native type of fruits where we're not spraying all the time, and pawpaws would fit that category. They are a little drought sensitive. They're used to growing the understory, but with some water they should be good to go. They're kind of difficult to propagate. The seeds take quite a while to germinate after they've been stratified, but they can be grafted to many improved cultivars. And Kansas State, Purdue, Arkansas, there's a lot of areas doing research on pawpaws. And so there are some cultivars that are improved type of pawpaws for better production. So they're kind of hard to find the trees because they are very popular, and they can sometimes be expensive to find because they're in short supply. Some other possible fruits you might think about planting would be plums. There's many, many different types of plums. There's European, Japanese, sand plums, wild plums like sand plum, Mexican plum, there's jigsaw plum, there's all different kinds of plums that you can propagate and grow. Jujube is a fruit, the picture on the left side over there, it's kind of a little apple shape. They're a couple inches long usually. Kind of tastes like a dry apple to me. But jujube had very few pests, grows and produces like crazy once they're in an area they like. Don't have a lot of issues with growing them. Apricots, like I said, they're kind of iffy on production just because they bloom too early. Persimmons, we can grow common persimmons, you know, like you see in the wild. There are some select native persimmons that might have better fruit quality. There are some Japanese persimmons, you probably have seen those in the grocery store. They're a little cold sensitive, and if you have an area that's a little protected, they can grow for you. You can also grow Japanese persimmons onto the common rootstock, so it may have a little bit more cold hardiness due to that rootstock being there. And then there's hybrid selections of persimmons. I have some called David's Candy Corn. I've got several different types of persimmon that I'm growing at the research station. A chi, I've got to pass this around. It's just weird. I've never heard of a chi until the nurseryman that I was buying some other things, he said, why don't you try this? So I bought a chi tree, 2 different kinds, and one of them has fruit all over it this year. I'm hoping they go ahead and make. Let's see where it's at. I just cut a little piece off of it. Here it is. But they are fruiting on that terminal shoot area, but it's kind of fuzzy. See that? But they kind of look like a little mulberry, maybe. But they're supposed to be maybe a couple inches around and have a different texture than a mulberry. But yeah, they're fuzzy, aren't they? And so, but it's just covered with fruit. This, I don't know. I've got it, and it's growing like crazy at the research station. And so I'm excited that we might get some fruit. But from what I've read, they can produce several hundred pounds of fruit on a mature tree. And well, some people you can eat them fresh. Other people make things out of them, juices or jellies or stuff, but also wine production. But anyway, it's interesting. It's growing really well. So if it doesn't have any issues growing, it might be something really interesting for home gardener use. So anyway, I was excited to find something that was easier to grow than some of our other fruits. And I just sat down my clicker and I don't know what I did with it. It's right there. Oh. So almond is something you might consider just on a trial run. Pomegranate, these are cold hardy pomegranates. I actually grew a fruit, which I was excited about. I cut it before the first hard freeze, and it looks like a pomegranate, right? Or it looks like a monster mouth. I don't know. It looks like a monster teeth to me. That's all I see now. But I tasted the arils, and they didn't have any sugar accumulated or any flavor. It was just not very pleasant. The thing about pomegranates, they need several months to ripen the fruit, and mine have been dying to the ground, and so they don't have enough time to grow to be big enough to flower until late in the season. If they didn't die to the ground, they would flower earlier in the spring and have time to ripen that fruit. So that's the issue that with pomegranates. But they do grow. There's some in the Botanic Garden, and pomegranates have been around for a long time. They're not going to be the same quality as what you see in the grocery store. Those are a different type of pomegranate, but these are cold hardy Russian pomegranates. Fleury and plumcots are hybrids of a fleury is a plum and a cherry. A plumcot is a plum and an apricot. I also have peacotum at the research station, so it's peach, apricot, and plum. And so I have one fleury that has beautiful foliage on it. It's just bright purple color right now. But the thing about the fleuries and the plumcots and all those hybrids, I think they're going to bloom very, very early. And so I don't know if we'll get very good fruit production. Some other small fruits that are on the trial page would be gooseberries and currants. A lot of people have grown these successfully for years, but they do like a little bit shadier, more protected area. And I have planted both of these in my yard this year, but just trying something different that don't have a lot of pests. That's what I'm looking for.
If you've got trees, a lot of trees on your place, like woods, whatever, gooseberries grow awesome. Because my parents lived in Missouri, and we used to go pick gooseberries all the time. They had 10 acres, and most of it was in trees.
Yeah. They do like a little bit of shade, that's for sure. They're more of they do a little bit better in cooler conditions, in areas that are a little cooler, or hot, dry winds. But there's many different types of gooseberries. You can have all different types, but they are thorny, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And so that's one that you have to put up with. All right, so some small fruits. Blueberries, that's one of my favorite things. I love blueberries. I got to work in East Texas one summer and worked with blueberries for the whole summer. But they are very finicky. They need a soil that's very acidic, and if it's not at that pH level, they're going to struggle. And so I have planted some in containers at my house. We've planted them in the ground at the research station years ago, and they just never did well. So I'm using these smart pots, because they hold moisture well, but they also will not stay too wet. So they drain really well also. And that's important for blueberries. But I can mix my own soil, use something that's specific to blueberries or azaleas, or just a bark and peat mulch or nursery mix. Use some acid type of product to keep the pH down, and then mulch it with conch shells or pine needles or something that's acidic as well. But these work really well because they stay moist, they stay wetter, easier than the big kettle tubs. They dry out quicker than these, and so but they don't stay too wet either. So those are really great. They do need high quality irrigation water. If yours has salt in it or other minerals, they don't like that. And so they want to stay moist, but not wet. So good drainage is important. You want to match your variety or the type you're growing with your location. And so if in this area you would be right on the line, you could grow high bush or southern high bush. Just make sure that when you go to buy those blueberries that it's in that category. You would want to stay away from the rabbit eye. They're more of a southern area and won't do as well for you. The blueberries that I see at the big box stores often are going to be rabbit eye, and so that's not a good fit for most of the state. So know what you're buying before you buy it. And the other thing I would say about blueberries is if you do go to the big box store and they have things on clearance at the end of the year, don't try to save a blueberry. You want to start off with the best quality. So start with something that's healthy and don't take something that's already struggling. But aren't the flowers beautiful? I just really love them. So grapes are another thing that I think would work really well for a home garden. Table grapes are great, but we also have wine grapes and muscadine. They are very sensitive to 2,4-D, so if you're spraying for broadleaf weeds in your lawn or you have a pasture area around you, you can have damage. The wine grapes are especially susceptible to many diseases. The table grapes are not as susceptible, but there's a lot of variety and selection. You can have red, blue, black, green table grapes. They can be seeded or seedless. They can be slip skin or non-slip skin. And a slip skin means usually if you take a bite of that grape, the pulp ends up in your mouth and the skin ends up in your fingers. So it separates very easily. Whereas a non-slip skin usually have thinner skin and you bite through the skin and the pulp that's attached. And the harvest can be very, very extended as well. They do require a trellis and annual pruning, but I think table grapes would be a great addition. That one up the top on the left is Neptune. Has very fruity flavor, very large clusters. They don't all ripen at the time. Very, very nice grape. I just threw in this list of some of the cultivars for table grapes. You can see a lot of them are planet names. And so the Mars is probably the most disease-resistant hardy grape that you could grow. It kind of has that Concord flavor, or the Welch's grape juice flavor. It's called a foxy flavor. Concord doesn't ripen evenly here, so we want to stay away from Concord and use some of these others that do better. But there's a lot of choices. 2012, Arkansas released Faith, Hope, Joy, Gratitude. In 2017, they released Passion or Compassion. So most of the planet names and those are released from the University of Arkansas. Blackberries are probably one of the easiest fruits to grow. They have perennial roots, so once they're established, they'll be there for many years. But they have biennial canes, so they live for 2 years and then they die to the ground. So the first year, they send up a vegetative shoot, and that's called a primocane. So it's just vegetative, just has leaves. It overwinters, and then it becomes a floricane, and it will produce fruit on that same shoot. After that fruits, that winter, or after it fruits, it begins to die back to the ground. So you have to remove those primocanes every year and replace with new, remove the floricanes every year and replace with primocanes. So you have a cycle of replacement. So they need pruning every season. There are some new cultivars that are primocane fruiting, so they will come up in the spring and then they fruit in the fall. You can tip them in the fall and they'll fruit again in the spring. So a little bit different, but they're flowering in the heat of the summer. So that makes it difficult to have good, big quality fruit. So not as easy to grow as some of the others. We have thorny types and thornless types. This is a Natchez, and it's about as long as my fingers. It's huge blackberry. It's a thornless, very tasty, early ripening. But we need to thin those and prune them out every season. So you take out all the dead canes and then thin out and leave maybe 3 to 5 canes per plant each year. And this just lists some of the different types. We have thorny and thornless. I would never recommend a thorny cultivar to anybody. I don't like. There's nothing about those that are any better than the thornless, and they're just a lot worse to work with. I mean, you can look at this one. It had thorns everywhere, even on the leaves. And so they didn't just scratch you, but they stuck in you, and they would break off the plant, and you'd have thorns all over your arms. So very nasty. So I've grown Apache, Natchez, Ouachita, Osage Triple Crown. I've grown those, and they do really well. The last couple of years, Arkansas released a Caddo and a Ponca. I'm going to try to get a couple of those and grow them for myself at home. But blackberries are probably the easiest of the fruit plants to grow. Strawberries can be easy, but you have to do some specific things to keep them doing well. But strawberries are very versatile. You can use them in your flower beds, in your vegetable garden, in containers, or in your landscape. They can be, useful in different areas of your, in lots of different ways. They can be planted as a matted row, as a perennial crop, where you leave them in place and then thin them out each year. You kind of thin out the plants to get more airflow and reduce the disease pressure. Or you can grow them as an annual crop, much like people grow vegetables these days, where they have a burned area. They plant their strawberries at the end of the season after they've harvested them. They just rip up the plastic from plants and they start over again the next year. So it's an annual crop. And that makes those big giant berries that you see at the grocery store, I think they're too big, don't you? I don't like those great big ones. I don't think they taste as good. But that's what makes those great big berries, is using those annual plasticulture crops. You want to avoid low areas that may stand in water or be colder than other areas. They do need full sun, and we want to avoid any weeds really, but especially perennial. Strawberries don't have a very good root system. They don't have root hairs, so they can't fight for water and nutrients very well. So they're a little harder to work with, especially if it's weedy. There are a couple different kinds of strawberries to look at when you're purchasing. We have Juneberry. They produce a single crop in the spring. They ripen anywhere from May to late June. And then the Everbearing, some people call them Never-bearing, but Everbearing fruit beginning in mid-May to mid-June, and then they continue through the fall. The crop and the quality is not going to be as good on an Everbearing versus a Juneberry. Okay? Mulching sometimes helps to reduce problems with disease and things as well. Container growing is good for some areas, especially if you have limited space or your soil may not be the greatest, like mine. So this is one of my fig plants in one of those big tubs, and my husband moves it in and out of our storm shelter, so it's protected. And I don't know how many years he's going to do that for me. It's kind of heavy. But anyway, that works to protect them. You could move them in an unheated garage, just somewhere that it doesn't get too cold. A dolly, move them around in your yard or into your garage or something. They may need different type of pruning in containers, kind of almost like a little bonsai. You want to keep them smaller. You may have to pull them up and reduce the root growth as well. But you want to really carefully monitor the soil and the nutrition of those plants, because it's much different than growing in native soil. And so this is the mineral tubs like I have. This is at Owasso Tree and Berry Farm, where they grow all of their blueberries in smart pots. And so that's a big commercial blueberry production, and it works really well. Have little micro sprinklers to water them, and does great. So figs, blueberries, really highly dwarfing rootstocks for fruit trees, or strawberries would be good for containers. Training fruit trees, I have a fact sheet that tells all about how to train and prune them. But for apples and pears, things that want a central leader like pecan, we want to have one main strong trunk. So we have one trunk. Apples, pears, some cherries, pecan. So we want to have a central leader. We don't want to have multiple leaders at the top. What happens if we have multiple leaders when that tree gets mature? Those limbs continue to grow and they push on each other. So when they get a big crop, we might have ice or something, those two limbs can split and we might lose the entire tree. So we want to maintain that central leader, one leader in charge if possible. For the peach, we do the open center. So our trunk is terminated at knee high, and then we'll select 3 to 5 scaffold branches coming off from below that cut. And then we'll prune it back to have sub-scaffolds. So we end up having like a bowl or a vase like this. So when you stand next to the trunk of a peach tree, you should be able to look up and see only sky. If you see branches coming over you, then you need to prune it and open it up, because that sunlight and airflow needs to get into those fruit areas, right? So it's very important to set that structure early. This is an apple at the research station. A lot of the time they'll kind of have that Christmas tree shape where they'll be smaller at the top and wider at the base. This is a dwarf fruit stock. Some of the master gardeners from Payne County came out and learned about pruning, and so that was their handiwork this spring. But it's just mainly about opening up and keeping all the wood from growing in the interior. We want it to grow outward. And growth that's very vertical or upright is not going to be fruitful. Horizontal wood is more fruitful. Okay? That fact sheet goes through all the steps. There's even fancy things. You can do espalier training for things like apples and pears and other types of fruit trees. The picture on the left is a pear. It was at the Biltmore Estates. And you know, you can do any kind of design. You just have to have kind of a knowledge of how the plant grows, kind of an art and a science. This is at the Botanic Garden. These are Kiefer pears, and it's an Oriental hybrid. And so this section is in the sun. This one has just a little bit of shade, so they grew much slower, but a little easier to maintain that shape than in full sun. But they needed some pruning to get that structure in place. But that's at the Botanic Garden if you're ever in Stillwater and want to see that. So I'm going to try to do some gala apples at my house this year, and my husband's supposed to build me a trellis to grow them on. But it's just leaving the right fruit. Do I?
He said, yeah, sure.
No, he's very helpful. He likes to eat my apple pies. So, but anyway, it's an art and a science. So there's lots of different ways to design your fruit training. Then there's other specialty methods or growth habits. This is a columnar apple, so they're very upright. They don't have a lot of branching, and so that they have spurs. And so the fruit grows really tight to the tree. So if you have limited space, you can have 2 different types of columnar apples and still have plenty of room. So I've got a few of these at the research station in my house as well. This is a different method. It's a, I just went down on the method. But it's a high density apple planting that a lot of the growers in the northeastern parts of the country are doing this method where they're training them more in a trellis situation for apples. But this was in Italy. A master gardener sent me that picture of an apple tree that was growing in a fence row. So you can do a lot to manage that growth. You just have to know which buds to leave and how to direct that growth. And it's not a one-time during the season. You have to be out there every few weeks to do training. All right, there's my contact information. I have a pecan webpage. I don't have a fruit webpage. I've been thinking about adding that. I had this Oklahoma fruit has been removed by Facebook. And so I'm trying to get that back. And it's killing me because I take a picture, I'm like, I'm going to post, I can't post it. So, but I keep timely information on those web pages, what's happening in the pecan, the fruit world. I would see, anytime I'd see something unusual or it's time to do something, I would post about it. Here's this is a fabric mulch mat. Just wrote this to show you. You put the tree in the center, and then you kind of, you can use wires to to keep the edges down. And, but it's where the water can flow through, but the weeds will grow up through it. The better the quality of the mulch mat, the longer it's gonna last. But you're welcome to take a look at that. Also have these training stakes that if you're on, remember we want all our growth to come outward. We have very upright limbs. We can use this to manage the angles of our limbs, to spread them out to get a better angle on our wrenching. We don't always get what we want from nature, so we help it out. And then we also, I can show you some different fruits. I've got Asian pear. I've got some, here's my chia again. I've got some apples. I've got a plum. I thought the plum was gone with the freeze, but it survived. I've got a couple of different kinds of grape at different stages of bloom. And I've got, there's another apple. And then I've got a peach. So I wanted to show you on this peach leaf. This is usually where you would think of your fruit would be on the terminal branches, but I think these were blooming early, so we lost those fruit. But anything that was kind of secondary or tighter back to the interior of the tree went ahead and survived. So when we're thinking about thinning, how would we go about doing that? What would you do? What are some of the things that, what would you do first on any of these? There are a few that have damage from insects. Something like that. Some are smaller. This is from the research station. So some of the peaches have damage from insects or hail or something. Some are smaller. So which ones would we take off? So you can see where the feeding was.
The littlest ones.
We would take off the little ones, okay? And the damaged ones.
And even 4 inches.
We would want spacing between 4 to 6 inches. That one has some feeding on it as well. So I'm going to leave this top one, and then I'm going to so that would be sufficient for thinning. But if you want even larger peaches, I would do that. Okay? So if you have 4 to 6 inches, that's what we recommend, at least 4 to 6. But if you want even bigger peaches, take them 8 inches, 8 to 10 inches between fruits, and it makes even bigger. It has some effect, but it's really about fruit load. Yeah, variety will have some effect on size, but it really, if there's fewer fruit on that tree, they have much more energy, much more water to feed that one fruit. So if you thin them early, like at this stage, this is perfect time when they're about quarter size. You're getting them off early enough that they're not taking energy from that tree. So this is going to be the best time. Then we can take our fruit bag. We can take our fruit bag, put it on our little fruits, take it around, wrap it around. I'm not doing this very well, holding a branch and doing it too. But we put it on each one of those fruits, and from this point on, we don't have to spray that the peaches anymore. Okay? So you'll have a few of them. Go ahead and abort or fall off. But most of them, in general, as long as you aren't too crazy putting the bags on, but if you knock them too much, they'll fall off. So have to be careful when you're putting them on. But any questions about anything we talked about? You have my contact information. My email is usually the best way to find me because I'm out on the road or doing things quite a bit. But you're welcome to come up and take a look at I'll show you the difference on the bloom on the grape. Here's one variety, and each one of those is going to be a flower, and they open up You see the flowers, how they open up and expose the different parts. So these are tight and these are flowering. And so it's kind of interesting. You can see the timing of the blooms. You can see the little flower parts that are open. And you remember, grapes are wind pollinated and they're self-pollinated. So you don't have to cross-pollinate grapes. So you can have just one and have fruit. So I just thought this was kind of interesting to see the difference. And grapes kind of have a different fragrance to the bloom. When you're walking the vineyard, when they're all blooming, it has a little bit different smell. But the Asian pears are usually more round, but you can see they can put on way too many, like peaches, and they may have to be, what's olives? They may need to be thinned as well. They'll put on way too many fruits, but you can see the Asian pears. They have really pretty foliage. They're doing really good, and so some of these might have a little bit of rust starting, but they're developing pretty nicely. And then
Did you put those bags over the pear?
you can do those as well. Yep. It's going to be a little more difficult because you don't have the same setup as the peach. You can wrap it around the stem, and on these they have a very long. They have that very long stem on the pears, so it may be a little harder to get it attached to the tree itself. But yes, that will work on pears. I even had someone put them on their grapes because grapes have a lot of issues, but the grapes got expanded so much that it busted out of the bag. And then the plums and apples, you can see that there's not as many plums, but this was solid blooms before the freeze. And here's apples. They kind of come in clusters as well. So I would probably, it came off really easily. So I would take off at least one through the middle. But here's the plum. This is Bruce plum, and these are some apples. And a lot of the time they'll have I'll thin out that cluster a little bit. So here's the plum, and then the apples. I'll just usually take out the small. Yeah, plums will do well. And there's so many different kinds as well. Plums, and then I'll just, that one, it fell out, but yeah, that would be it. And here you can see one that didn't go ahead and pollinate properly. All right, so I think that's all, guys. If you have questions, Carla, can we do a giveaway? How can we do that for?
So we have 9 presents. I have a
Okay.
random number generator.
All right.
So